It's been about a week since we've began our voyage to the Sunken City, but I think I have the confidence to tell you guys what the 5 best meta decks are right now. But instead of just telling you guys 5 different decks to be playing right now, I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to showcase the 5 best aggro decks, the 5 best control decks, the 5 best combo decks, and what I believe to be the 5 most spicy decks that have come out in Standard since the expansion has released. So I have 20 entire deck lists for you guys in this video. And then at the end, I'm going to go through my top 5 best decks in the meta. So if you guys would like to see that, go ahead and go to this part in the video because, you know, I completely understand if you guys are just wanting to get your legend climb done as soon as possible because this meta is pretty diverse to say the least. But one of the first decks that I want to show you guys right now is Aggro Naga Demon Hunter because this is probably one of the most powerful decks in the metagame right now. One of my friends, Dabs, actually reached rank 90 legend with this list, and it's just pretty self-explanatory. The mulligan is just go for 1-drops and go for Drekthar and just steamroll the board, and then you have plenty of ways of being able to close out games thanks to the new Naga cards working so well together. And one key card to point out here is Lady Stethano, if that's how you pronounce it. This card is absolutely powerful because you have 0-mana interactions plus cards like Fel Barrage and a bunch of other spells in order to combo very, very effectively. Synergies like Dread Prison Glaive as well as Multi-Strike pretty much give you a mini Warglaze of Azzinoth, and there's lots of ways of being able to pressure insane amounts of damage with this deck. Not to go into too much detail, but there was a time that I was able to honorable kill an Ivus with 9 HP, and then I was able to swing face again in order to deal 18 damage all in one turn. So trust me, this deck absolutely crushes Druid if you're looking for something that destroys Ramp Druid. The next deck on the list is Pirate Rogue, and I'm choosing to spotlight a deck that does not run Hook Tusk because I believe that Hook Tusk is just a bit too slow in this meta right now. Sorry for the people that really want to make this card work, but I just don't see the payoff really working right now because it's not just about the fact that you have to draw the minion and play all the cards. It's just by the time that you played all the pirates, you're pretty much close to killing your opponent already, so I would just rather fill out this deck with cards that actually kill your opponent. We still do have the Plague Scientist Pufferfist combo in case you do need that kind of late game strategy because I don't believe this is an all-in aggro deck. I think this is more along the lines of like a mid-range aggressive deck to where you're still trying to close the game out as soon as possible, but you're not just throwing out all of your resources onto the field just to have them get wiped out by 1 or 2 cards. You really want to space out your threats, and you really want to try and get as much value out of your Smite combo because Smite into Filea Fighter is pretty freaking powerful. Another powerful combo with Smite is if you already have the Vessel at the bottom of your deck, you can play Smite into Gone Fishing for a 7-mana, 12 damage combo. So I think that this deck has a ton of burst potential in order to close out games quickly, but it could still go toe-to-toe and still go the distance in case you need to go to turn 10 and beyond. The next aggro deck is going to be Mech Mage. Although I do believe that a lot of people have kind of figured out how to beat this deck, there is just a lot of games where this deck is just going to steamroll anybody that does not have an optimized list. And I think if you're going for like an aggressive style of lineups for like Open Cups or for other tournaments, this might be a way to go if you're looking for ways of clearing games very, very quickly. I think that Gaia is absolutely necessary to run in this deck, but if you don't have the budget for him, then you still can discover it with like a Gorilla Bot. So maybe if you don't have the Dust, don't go ahead and craft it, but I think it would be a safe craft if you're wanting to play this deck specifically. The Storm Coil is really, really good with the Mothership because you just get insane amounts of value, but just making another mech is just, you know, it can really go the distance depending on the matchup that you have. But we all know how good Mech Mage is by this point because of how good Mecha Shark is, so if you want a really easy, pretty low budget deck, then you'll be able to play this deck without any problems. Next up is non-Ramp Druid because guess what? There's only one other archetype of Druid that people are really messing with right now, and I honestly believe that the Druid class is kind of being left in the dust due to this, you know, really, really powerful deck that we'll talk about later. But Beast Druid is still a really good deck, even though it may seem like a shadow of its former self because of the Lightning Bloom combos that we had back in Alterac Valley. But this deck is still as consistent as ever because 1-drops into 2-drops into consistent curve is still very powerful against a lot of decks that aren't really doing a lot of stuff in the early game. Plus, this deck can somewhat go toe-to-toe with Pirate Warrior if you're able to get insane Oracle Balloon value as well as your Frost Saber Matriarchs. So this deck is still very, very powerful. I'm still playing this deck in top 100 Legend, so I can definitely attest to this deck's strength, and it's really good at being able to corner the Ramp Druids that we were just mentioning. So if you're looking for a pretty simple aggro deck, this might be the way to go, but just know there's a decent amount of legendaries and epics that you really need for this deck that I would not recommend cutting. And the last aggro deck that I'm going to talk about is Pirate Quest Warrior. Do I really need to talk about why Pirate Quest Warrior is good? The only thing that I'll really point out about this deck is that we do run Nelly the Great Thresher, because I do believe this card does give you the high roll potential of the 1-mana Smite, but it's just good in order to have more beefy stuff going into the late game rather than just going for the Rokara as soon as possible. Yeah, Rokara as soon as possible is definitely game breaking, but Nelly the Great Thresher is not only a great way to utilize some of the new cards, but its high rolls really do make a difference in order to close out some of the games where you just don't have enough card draw. Now that the aggro decks are done, let's go ahead and check out some of these combo decks, because there's a lot of different combos that are possible in this meta. But right now, I want to show you guys BioFreeze Shaman. And one thing that I'm actually going to do to this deck, in case you guys want to tech against specific matchups, you actually can take out an Ire Deep Trog and put in a Viper. This is actually something that I meant to do because of the rise of Control Paladin, which is something that we'll see later on. But I believe if you're trying to make a tournament style of deck, this is the better way of doing it. But if you're going for ladder, then just going for this double Trog is still a good combo. So you could really make this this change interchangeably, because it really won't matter too much depending on what you're going up against. But overall, I believe that Bioluminescence is one of the best ways to make Shaman right now, and this is also known as Rainbow Shaman in case you see it on other websites, so it's still the same archetype. But I think that everyone has agreed that Bioluminescence spell damage is just the way to go for Shaman right now, because of how consistent that you can build up boards. And honestly, one synergy that I really like with this deck is Bran into School Teacher or Nagalings, because you have lots of ways of being able to cheat out 3-mana spells and copy them twice for 2 mana essentially. And yeah, I just think that this is probably the best way to play Shaman right now. And after about a week of different people trying out different things, there's a lot of things that hit, there's a lot of things that miss, like Kragwa. Kragwa wasn't good, that was pretty much bait. But I think this is the best 30-card list that you can expect from Shaman right now. Next up, we're going to talk about Charge Warrior, and yes, I do have an actual Control Warrior in case you guys want to play something that is not just a combo burst option for Warrior. But I saw this deck get a pretty decent amount of games when I was casting DreamHack the other day, and we actually saw a turn 7 combo with this deck possible, not only just because of the Captain Galvan Guard being so consistent of getting value, you know, because 15 armor isn't that much of a requirement, but because of the new 3-mana card from the depths. This card, with the game that I saw specifically, there was a 0 mana to the front, so there's a lot of mana cheating that this deck can do, to the point where you don't even have to worry about building up the full combo, because you have lots of ways of just being able to build up lots of mini combos for not that much mana. So this deck is actually kind of interesting because it also utilizes Sir Finley's Sea Guide, probably to the best potential that I've seen in this meta so far, and we're also seeing a pretty cool combination of cards like Forge in the Flame with other weapons as well, so I just think that was pretty cool. But overall, I think that this deck has a lot of different ways of being able to win, where you can play a control deck when necessary, but you also have this ridiculous, you know, this ridiculous combo that's enabled whenever you do have the mana discount. And of course, Faceless Manipulator on opponent's Ibises is just a great way of being able to sometimes deny Druids if you do have a way of being able to counter them. So I think that this deck has a lot of potential right now to be a really game-changing combo deck. Next up is Naga Mage, and I feel like we just had to put it in the combo section because putting it in control just isn't that accurate, I would say, of what this deck is trying to do. The reason I wanted to put it in control is because this may be a combo deck that has a lot of APM and a lot of value that you have to get quickly, but ultimately this is a deck that really relies on not just building up its own board, but denying your opponent's board at the exact same time. And that's mostly because, you know, when you're building up your board of Nagas, you need something in order to throw your spells onto, and the last thing that you want to do is just to waste like First Flames on your own minions. So I think that this goes in the combo section, but I really do want to highlight how this deck is probably one of the best decks in the meta right now, if not the best deck. Spoiler for the top 5 list, in case you guys haven't skipped ahead to this part, in case you want to go ahead and see what the top 5 are right now. But in any case, Habu Kabu hit rank 1 legend, going 71-17. Let me say that again. He went 71-17. In case you guys don't want to do the math, that's an 81% win rate. Absolutely unreal results that I've ever seen in Hearthstone. I don't think I've ever seen anybody have a climb that good before. And yes, he did hit rank 1 legend with it. So yeah, it's a pretty good deck. It's my favorite deck of the expansion. Expect a future video about it because this deck is absolutely nuts. And I really hope if there's any balance changes in the future, this deck is not hit because it's got a very big skill ceiling. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this deck if you want something that's a little bit more challenging, because this is definitely my favorite deck of this expansion. Next up on the combo decks is debatably one of the most difficult decks to play in this expansion right now, and that is going to be OTK Mill Priest. One thing that I will suggest for you guys is, in case you don't necessarily want to run 2 of the rituals, one thing that I kind of like about this list is Bunny Hopper's idea of putting in a Ruin, because if you have a turn where you want to like try and like set up the combo where you also want to play like more shellfish, you have a way of being able to kill them with this spell, as well as not being able to destroy your brand. But I think that this is just mostly in here in order to stop Naga Mage, or I'm sorry, Naga Druid from being absolutely game breaking, because you need a way of being able to deal with those giants and those very large Miracle Growth bodies. But in any case, I think that this deck is somewhat of a challenge, so I would not suggest this deck for the faint of heart. But Meaty was able to reach rank 2 legend with this deck. I already have a video covering this in case you want more information about it. But this deck is just probably one of the weirdest things that I've seen pop up that can get somewhat consistent results. Again, this deck is very, very difficult to play because it's very, very dependent on knowing just what you need to do in terms of how many spells that you need to combo in with the Priestess for your combo turn, whether or not you need to use the Brand Zola combo because it's not 100% necessary, but you do definitely need the Brand into the Zarella combo with enough Shellfish dead in order to combo your opponent, so counting is very, very important. But overall, this deck was something that just absolutely blew my mind that was a possibility, and I have to share it with you guys because I do believe that there is a place for this deck in the meta because it can beat Druid. And the last combo deck is Quest Hunter. Do I really need to talk about why Quest Hunter is good as well? We all get why these quest decks are good, right? But just to give a quick summary of why this deck is very good, it's just very consistent. You can get your Tavish by like turn 6, but it's also got one of those things to where like this deck can kind of space out its resources. It's got a lot of ways of being able to cheat the board with Drekthar. It has insane combo potential with the new legendary if you do happen to cheat out of your Drekthar. There's a lot of potential with insane card draw turns with Ferocious Howl. So there's just a lot of things that this deck can do, and that's not even getting into the Beast Stalker Tavish possibilities, which I believe is core if you're playing this deck because you want the option of being able to play Animal Companions if you go up against like Control Warriors or something that maybe you can't just burst down immediately. But one thing I will give credit to this deck for, especially in this particular meta, which is something I didn't believe this deck had in Alterac Valley, is that just going for face is not something that you can do every single game with this deck. So being able to know when you have to charge face and when you have to go for a more spread out game plan is very important to do well with this deck. Even though I don't like it, I will definitely say that it has a place in the meta right now. Now let's go ahead and dive into some control decks, because man, do I have a spicy control deck for you right here. I really couldn't put this in the spiciest deck list because I really needed some spots in the control slots, but I'll just say that this deck is not bait. I saw Nalgadan qualify for a Masters Tour by winning a DreamHack Open Cup, so that was very, very impressive because I did not think that this deck was possible at first. I knew that Equality Pyromancer was such a good combo that there had to be at least one deck that utilizes it, and luckily this one is it. I know that I said that I didn't want to go into too much detail about a lot of these decks, but one thing that I will definitely tell you guys is that Righteous Defense with Smite can be absolutely game-breaking. There's a lot of like little synergies with this deck that may not be immediately known, but like the Garden's Grace work really well with your deck because you have cards like Immortalized in Stone to give you a lot of stall. And to be honest, Lifeforge Cariel is especially powerful right now because a lot of people are not running Vipers. In the tournament meta, that's not the case because everyone's running Vipers right now, so word of caution if you do want to play this deck. But this deck is the absolute pinnacle of good Hearthstone and being able to plan out your turns, because it's not just like a simple deck where you just play your 1-drops, play your 2-drops, yada yada yada. You got to really think about how you make your opponent's game plan as awkward as possible. And one other thing that I'll point out is that Cariel Rome in this deck literally could just feel like an Octobot, because if you have nothing but holy spells, which let's go ahead and take a look here. We got Equality, we have Flash of Light, Holy Mackerel is a holy spell, Immortalized in Stone. Like there's a lot of holy cards, and to the point where I've literally seen this card discount an entire hand before. Control Paladin, pretty good, and that's why I'm talking a lot about it, because I really want this deck to be popular. It's probably not a ladder deck in all honesty, but in tournaments this deck has a ton of potential. So if you have a pocket meta where this might work on ladder, then go ahead and give this a try. But I really do believe that we're going to see this deck a lot more consistently in either Open Cups or more tournament metas. And the next control deck is Ramp Druid, and the only reason why I'm putting this in the control slot is because this deck really is playing control until suddenly it generates a board that your opponent has no business of being able to clear unless they're a control warrior or something like that. Kazakhstan, I think, is fine in this deck. If you want my honest opinion, I'm probably going to get a few people that are going to disagree with me in the comments, so feel free to let me know if you do think that Kazakhstan is balanced in this deck. But one thing that I like about this is that the deck is not just focused on going on Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is truly shining as an actual win con because you're not going to play him until you've drawn your entire deck. One thing that is, important to point out, though, is Kazakhstan feels very unfair when you still have 20 mana because of the Guff possibilities. So I still think that this deck, could potentially be nerfed in the future, but I personally don't want to see it. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments, but I still think that this deck functions as a control deck because you still need to use your scales a lot of the time in order to give you that very key turn to come back, and if you're not controlling the board, you're never going to be able to reach your massive pop-off turns. So I think that Ramp Druid still has a place in the meta. I don't think it's as oppressive as everybody says, but when you go up against this deck and you see the turn 2 Jerry Rig into Wild Growth, into Nourish, into Miracle Growth, or even into Scales, and as some aggro decks really don't want to see, this deck can just become very frustrating. So I think that the community is well understood by not liking this deck, but I don't think it's necessarily going to go anywhere because I would like to see the meta flourish a little bit more. But regardless, play this deck right now because if you're worried about it getting nerfed, you definitely want to play it before it's gone. The next control deck that we'll go over is Control Warrior, and I think that this deck has a lot of potential because this deck got a lot of support within this next expansion that really gave it a different way of being able to shape itself. In the past, we really only had Charge Warrior and this weird Dragon Warrior as a possibility for playing the Control Warrior archetype, and I really don't like the idea of just playing Kazakhstan on turn 8 as Control Warrior because we really don't have this great way of being able to draw cards and really cycle through the treasure. So I really do believe that you need to use Kazakhstan as a late game win con in order to really use it properly in the Warrior class specifically. Warrior has a lot of tools that are available right now, such as School Teacher, which is I think a great inclusion in this deck because you have lots of really cheap cards such as Shield Block, Heavy Plate, Shield Slam, and even cards like Provoke that you can find out of the Naga Ling. There's tons of really useful tools that can be very flexible that Warrior just sometimes needs. You still have Queen Ashara in order to give you a Colossal minion if you need it, but the Ring is probably debatably one of the best cards in this deck because it's just another brawl. It's just another way of gaining armor. It's just another way of getting a really useful tool, but you can use it interchangeably depending on the situation that you're in. Nelly, I think, is a great tool for this deck because it gets you a taunt minion and even more Pirates, which Pirates can be pretty good depending on what you get. You have cards like Scoundrel that can give you resources. You have cards like the Rush guy, which I can't remember his name. I think it's like Gangplank Diver or something like that, but regardless, the Pirates aren't necessarily that crucial, but having a taunt get in the way and just having some extra resources can be very, very effective. And then, of course, you have cards like Talon to give you something like Raid Boss Nixia, which is just probably one of the best cards available for Control Warrior right now. But this deck is surprisingly powerful, even though it may not look all too fancy. But Control Warrior just finds a way of being able to dominate on the aggressive decks right now. So if you're a fan favorite of this, feel free to play this deck because I think this is probably the best way to play Control Warrior that isn't running some kind of gimmicky combo. This next control deck is kind of a weird one because it can somewhat function as an aggro deck, it can somewhat function as a combo deck. It can kind of go, it can go the distance in a lot of different ways, but at its heart, I still do believe it's a control deck because you want to keep your opponent off the board while you're setting up either your aggressive turns or your massive payoffs. But in any case, I do believe that Fel Demon Hunter has a very real chance of being a contender in this meta because Eldrazi Warblades is still just a great way of being able to get massive amounts of game-winning healing, especially against aggro decks that can't, close that gap. In Naga Demon Hunter, there was some people that were trying to make this work, but the 5-attack weapon is just superior because damage is really important, while Fel Demon Hunter can afford to get this kind of healing because there are lots of dead turns if you don't have your early game curve. But you still do have the potential of having an insane early game because you have the Vicious Slither Spear, you have Amalgam of the Deep or in your Vanguard in order to fill out those other turns, and you still have these amazing lady combos with with these other spells that are still in the deck in order to give you this ridiculous payoff if you do get that lucky. But regardless, I do like this deck because you have a lot of synergies with like Felgorger and the Glaive Shark in order to give you ways of being able to play around your opponent by playing like Fel Barrages to keep them off the board. This deck just feels like if you enjoy more of a control style of deck other than just going all in with the Naga Demon Hunter, because that deck can be somewhat of a glass cannon at times. So if you want something that's a little bit more different, I would definitely suggest Fel Demon Hunter because it could definitely compete in this meta. And the last control deck that we'll go over is Alutemu's Boar Priest. He was able to reach rank 4 legend with this deck on the Asia ladder, and we have a lot of GMs that are really praising this deck very highly. And the reason why is because a lot of people are getting like Garrote Rogue vibes from this deck, where if you play it perfectly, it feels like you can win almost every single matchup in the game right now. Apparently, this deck is supposed to be favored into Druid if you play it correctly. However, I don't have I don't have a big enough brain in order to really see how this deck is favored against Druid. There might be ways of being able to get the Boar combo very, very consistently, very quickly, but I just personally have not been able to play this deck enough in order to really see it yet. But I would highly suggest checking out Alutemu's channel, checking out Frozen, or even checking out Monsanto, because they are definitely leagues above me in any regard. But in any case, this deck is very, very consistent because it's pretty much playing Control Priest. I know that a lot of people are like, lol, it's a combo deck, but you really are controlling the board until you get the sword. So just, you know, control the board, get the sword, have some fun with the boar, and yeah, deck code is down below. Play some Boar Priest. Now let's go ahead and jump into the spicy lists, because I have some pretty good deck lists for you guys. And what better way to start this off than showing you guys Golden Monkey Paladin. This deck is not good. I'll just go ahead and tell you that right now. This deck is definitely not good, but I was able to get a turn 7 and a turn 8 monkey in two separate games. So if you really want to play Golden Monkey, this is the deck to do it with. But the reason why this deck is very consistent is because the only minions that you really run are Elise Starseeker as well as your Alliance Bannermans. So you have Vitality Surges in order to help you draw your Elises as soon as possible. And then once you do play your Elise, you do have your Stoneheart the Vindicators in order to help you draw the spell that gets shuffled into your deck, so you can draw the map very consistently, play it for 0 mana, and then you can even play the other Alliance Bannerman or your other Vitality Surge in order to draw the monkey. So you have ways of being able to tutor it, but you kind of have to butcher the rest of your deck with, you know, a lot of really bad spells that don't synergize very well together. And you're running Dunbalar Bridge. I butchered the name on this card, but regardless, you're playing this really bad 4-mana card that doesn't have a lot of synergy with the deck because you're just so focused on getting the Golden Monkey. I fell for it. I lost a few ranks with this deck. It's not a good ladder deck, but if you want to play a fun deck against your friends, you gotta play some Golden Monkeys. And if you have the core set, you get this card Golden, so you automatically have a Golden Monkey, which replaces your deck with nothing but Golden Legendaries. So go ahead and play a Golden Monkey and make your day in Hearthstone just that much better. Next up is Bomber Rogue, and this is a deck that just feels like it goes all in on this amazing meme of being able to double up Death Rattles with your Naval Mine. I have played this deck only twice, but there was one game where I was able to potentially get a turn 5 lethal, but I unfortunately misplayed and did not do things correctly. You have the synergy of your Forsaken Lieutenants in order to work with your mines, you have Shrouded Concealment in order to draw these very important cards, and you even have Counterfeit Blade in order to get your Naval Mines down. So, like, there's just a lot of ways of being able to copy the Death Rattles, and just one thing to keep in mind is that if you do have the Snowfall Graveyard on the field when you do have the Naval Mine, like, that's 8 damage, dude. If you have the Counterfeit Blade as well, then you can literally deal 16 damage with just 1 blade. This is kind of an all-or-nothing deck, so it's very much of a glass cannon, but if you're looking for something that's a bit of a meta breaker that has potentials of killing your opponent as early as turn 5, turn 6, this deck actually has a lot of potential, but I don't think it's any means consistent. And speaking of inconsistent, you guys have probably already seen this deck, but Scam Priest has been gaining a lot of popularity, especially on HS Replay, because a lot of people are pointing out how this the minions in this deck, when you draw them, have a 1% win rate, because you really can't afford to draw the minions in this deck. The whole point of this deck is to play Switcheroo, so that way your Murlock gets the 12/12 stats of the Deathwing, so that way you have 2 12/12s for 3 mana. And let's be honest, if this thing sticks, you're just probably going to win the game, even if you don't have a card like Bless in order to buff onto it. But just in case you do happen to draw the minion, you do technically have Call of the Grave in order to give you some other way of winning the game. But let's be honest, the whole point of this deck is to have fun with Switcheroo. This is kind of like another problematic deck to where you either get the high roll or you don't, and if you do get the high roll, your chances of winning are just absolutely ridiculous. So maybe this is a reason why this deck, or why this card might get nerfed in Standard. This is more of a wild problem, obviously because of Boar in the Darkness, but I think that Switcheroo is somewhat fine in Standard right now. It's not that much oppressive, but if this deck was top tier, I would want to see this card nerfed immediately. So unfortunately, we're kind of in this weird spot of Switcheroo being like kind of okay in Standard, but being detrimental in Wild. But this is just one of the ways that it can be detrimental in Standard, but it's just not nearly as bad as, you know, taking 40 damage by like turn 4. So regardless, if you want to play a fun scam deck, I would highly recommend this deck, but just don't draw the minions because, you know, you're a bad Hearthstone player if you draw the minions. And next up on the spicy lists is Murlock Warlock, and the only reason why I couldn't put this in the aggro section is because unfortunately this deck is just not as consistent as a lot of people would hope it to be. But the reason why I'm putting this in the spicy deck lists is because Battleground Battlemaster is making an appearance in Murlock Warlock of all decks, mainly due to the fact that Chum Bucket high rolls can give you pretty consistently a 10 attack Murloc, and if you happen to stick that on the field, then giving a Murloc Wind Fury just makes a lot of sense right now. Unfortunately, this deck is very much of a glass cannon to where once it runs out of resources, it feels extremely difficult in order to get the board back, to the point where I've even seen some people play the Dreadlich hero card in order to get even more card draw. Like, this card is really not worth it in the deck, but there are some people that thought it might be worth it to try and give yourself some kind of comeback ability. But I really do believe the best way to play this deck is just to go all in on the Murlocs. And honestly, Wind Fury with Murlocs can work even if you don't have Chum Bucket value, because you do have cards like Murloc War Leader that are back in the rotation. So I think this deck is probably the best way of being able to enjoy Murloc Warlock right now, but unfortunately, it didn't make it in the top 5 aggro decks for a reason, because this deck can fall flat in a lot of instances. And the last deck on this list is something that I like to refer to as Fun Druid. I originally saw this deck on Regis's YouTube channel, but I think I've seen this deck pop around a few other streams as well. But it's not because this deck is absolutely powerful, it's because this deck has a lot of fun. The main way that this deck is trying to win games is by playing Guff in order to give yourself, obviously a ton of mana. But one thing that you can do with this deck is play Bran into the Green Thumb Gardener in order to give you a ton of value. So that way you can, have a card like Scale the Onyxia in your deck and refresh 14 mana, to where you can play cards like Dragon Queen, like Alexstrasza the Lifebinder, play Zola in order to give yourself 2 copies of Alexstrasza, play another Green Thumb Gardener. Like, you have a lot of mana to make this work, so there's a lot of potential with this deck of having some pretty sweet OTKs. I haven't played this deck yet myself, but I'm probably going to play it in one of these next few streams, because this deck looks like a lot of fun, and it just looks like a good way of being able to play Guff without absolutely breaking the game and playing like 4 8/8s as early as like turn 7 or something like that. So if you guys want to have fun with a deck that's not just playing, the typical Druid list, I think that this might be a healthy way of being able to approach Guff without thinking that Druid is just all manners of busted, even though when this combo does work, it does feel like all manners of busted. So go ahead and play some Fun Druid today, and stop focusing on your ranks. We're only a week into the expansion right now. Let's have some fun, why don't we? Oops, I apologize. Did I just say that we're having fun? No, because we're going into the top 5 meta decks that are going to be the best decks to climb to Legend with right now. And the first deck that I'm going to recommend is going to be Naga Demon Hunter. It's the very first deck that I covered in this video, and I felt it felt appropriate to put it as the very first deck in the top 5, because this deck is very quickly gaining steam into being one of the best aggro decks in the metagame right now. I don't think it's an understatement to say that Lady Stetheno is absolutely busted when you have her on the field by itself, and when you have the 0 mana combination with this the spell right here, it just works perfectly at being able to crush druids. I literally have not lost to a Ramp Druid yet while playing this deck, so again, if you are seeing that deck very consistently and you want to be able to beat it, this is going to be the way to go, and this might be the reason why Guff and Druid doesn't end up getting nerfed, because there are consistent ways of being able to beat it. People just need to be familiar with it. So if you're struggling against Druid and you want ways of being able to have insane high rolls with this glaive, to have pretty much an unnerfed Warglaze of Azzinoth, I cannot recommend this deck enough. It probably is one of the best decks to play right now. Number 4 on my top 5 list is going to be Pirate Rogue, due to the fact that this deck has a lot of ways of being able to be played, and it's not just an aggro deck that just plays everything and then runs out of gas. This deck has a ton of unpredictable turns, especially when you have the Smite into Gone Fishing that pulls out the Sunken Vessel, because again, that's just 12 damage for 7 mana. It feels absolutely unreal with everything else that this deck can do, and the fact that Rogue has an AoE that can destroy everything just absolutely blows my mind. People are still complaining about not having Fan of Knives, but they have this amazing combo in order to give this deck a reliable way of being able to, you know, when it does fall behind, give itself a way to come back. I think that comeback ability is very important for this deck, and the reason why it's so consistent right now. So if you guys are wanting to play a pretty fun Rogue deck, unfortunately we're not playing Hook Tusk, but this deck is still very consistent to where I have to put it at number 4 on my list. At number 3, we have BioFreeze Shaman, and I really want to sell you guys on the name of this because I want to be responsible for naming a deck in Hearthstone. That's the only reason why I'm so sold on calling it BioFreeze Shaman. But I really do believe that this is not only one of the best Shaman decks out there, but this is just one of the best decks in general because, you know, Free Shaman just absolutely destroys most aggro decks out there, and you have this amazing, consistent win con of having ridiculous amount of spell damage possible. Because one thing that I really like about this deck is that if you're consistently freezing your board and your opponent doesn't solve it, like suddenly you just have the Bioluminescence just get so much value very, very easily because they're not focusing on clearing your minions because they're not an active threat at the time. But there are ways of being able to win this game outside of just playing the freeze game. You have ways of being able to tempo cards because you have cards like School Teacher, and you have amazing combinations with Nagalings that are possible. So I just really think that this deck deserves a spot in the top 5 because of its newfound consistency and how good it is in open cups. Like, my god, this deck is just the bring right now for open cups if you're wanting to counter the aggro meta right now. Second on my list definitely goes to Ramp Druid because literally this is the deck that everyone is trying to beat right now for a reason. The high rolls that are possible with this deck seem a little bit unfair and sometimes unpredictable because there's not much that you can do against an Oracle Balloon into 2 gigantic Ibises, play Innervate into essentially Reno Jackson for 1 mana. So yeah, Ramp Druid just feels like it's going to be a meta contender for quite some time until we have a bunch of decks that can somewhat push this deck out. But in order for that to happen, the other decks that beat Druid have to not just beat Druid, they have to beat other archetypes. So if we see this kind of development in the meta, then Druid is slowly going to be pushed out. But for right now, it is number 2 on my list due to the fact that it's just insanely consistent. It seems to be the deck that everyone is flocking to right now in the top legend ranks for a reason, and this deck probably gets banned almost 100% of the time in tournaments. The last tournament that I casted, literally Druid got banned every single time except for 1 game, and in the 1 game that it was played, it absolutely dominated. So if you're wanting to play something that seems a little bit unfair, this deck is definitely for you. And sitting at number 1 is Naga Mage. I just cannot undersell how good this deck is because Habu Gabu with 71 and 17 with this deck to hit rank 1 legend in EU. Like, that is just absolutely unreal to me, and I've never seen a sample size that good in my entirety of playing Hearthstone through pretty much since the beginning of the game's release. So I think that this deck has a lot of potential because this card is just pretty much Dark Glare for Mage. Just one thing that I have to point out is that it is not a weakness to say Naga spell, Naga spell, Naga spell in order to play this correctly. Just do it because the last thing that you want to do is to, you know, play a spell when you meant to play a Naga and then suddenly the chain doesn't work anymore. But I believe that this is the best list to play because spell damage can be an effective way of being able to close out games. Plus, having your first flames being able to kill minions of 3 HP is very important against decks like Pirate Warrior. This deck just feels unbelievably consistent due to the Commander Shavara being able to shuffle spells back into your deck to make these high rolls work even better. School Teacher, one of my favorite cards of the expansion, just works really well in order to enable the turn 5 possibility with the Siren very consistently because you do need a 1-mana Naga in order to make that happen. I know I said that I didn't want to talk too much about how these decks function, but oh my god, this deck just feels like the best, but it's very difficult to play, and some people need a little bit of a refresher on how this deck actually works and how it functions and how it's able to reach rank 1 legend with an 81% win rate. I cannot undersell that enough. So if you guys want to play what is debatably one of the hardest decks, as well as one of the most entertaining decks in this meta, as well as my personal favorite, play Naga Mage. You will not be disappointed. But there you go, guys. That is 20 decks that are playable for control, for aggro, for combo, and as well for spicy deck builders out there. And I also have that top 5 list for you guys, just so that way you know what the best legend decks are right now. But I've played a lot of Hearthstone in the past week. I'm still going to be making a lot more deck spotlights and a lot more deck guides. So feel free to let me know in the comments if there's a deck that you're just dying to see. The next decks that I have on my list are going to be Naga DH, as well as an updated version of Naga Mage. So if you guys enjoy this kind of content, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel, so that way you know when those videos come out. All the deck codes are down below, so if you want any of these decks, feel free, because I do these videos exactly for you guys, because I know how difficult it can be in order to find decks that you want to commit to as early as the first and second weeks of an expansion. As always, there's a Patreon in case you guys would like to support us there. We have special perks and bonuses that I will be updating here pretty soon in case you guys want to go ahead and directly support the channel. And as always, if you ever want to see any of my clips live, we stream at twitch.tv/ClarkHellScream. I hope you guys enjoyed this deck guide video, and I'm just gonna go ahead and just end it here. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you for the next video.